The dust of FOB Kestrel settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that worked its way into rifle actions, sealed rations, and the creases around a soldier's eyes. It was a place of high altitudes and low morale, a molar in the jagged jawbone of the Zargos Mountains, perpetually aching. Into this ache walked Master Sergeant Anya Sharma. She arrived on a dust-off chopper that had brought back 2 wounded and a crate of expired morphine, a trade that felt grimly appropriate for the outpost. She wasn't what they expected. The logistics NCO she was replacing, Sergeant First Class Jolly O'Malley, had been a booming, red-faced man who could procure a case of cigars in a war zone and tell a joke that made even Colonel Madsen crack a smile. Sharma was his opposite. She was a woman in her late 40s, with a face mapped by sun and time, and eyes the color of a winter sky that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. She moved with a quiet economy that felt less like military discipline and more like the conservation of energy one sees in creatures that live in harsh, unforgiving climates. Her presence was a vacuum where O'Malley's boisterous energy had been. The younger soldiers, led by the cocksure Sergeant First Class Riggs, a man whose muscles had muscles, watched her with open skepticism. They saw the gray streaks in her tightly bound hair, the slight stiffness in her gait on cold mornings, and they made their judgment. "Looks like they sent us a quartermaster from the archives," Riggs muttered to his crew in the mess tent, loud enough for Sharma to hear. She was 2 tables away, methodically eating a plate of reconstituted eggs, her focus entirely on her fork. "Probably here to count paperclips until her pension kicks in." Another soldier, a specialist named Carver, snickered. Sharma didn't flinch. She didn't look up. She simply finished her eggs, cleaned her tray, and walked out. Her silence was more unnerving than any retort would have been. It was the stillness that made them notice the other thing about her, the detail that became the focus of their derision. Pinned to the inside of her uniform blouse, just over her heart, was a piece of metal. It wasn't a standard-issue metal. It wasn't polished brass or gleaming silver. It was a crude, 5-pointed star forged from dark, pitted iron, hanging from a frayed, once-black ribbon. When she worked in the supply depot, her blouse unbuttoned 1 notch against the container's stuffy heat. The thing was visible. It was ugly. It looked like something a child might have made in a metal shop class. Its edges were sharp, unfinished, and the face of it was stamped with a symbol they couldn't quite make out. A sun, perhaps, but with jagged, broken rays. Riggs dubbed it the scrap iron star. The name stuck. It became a running joke, a symbol of the quiet, aging woman who had replaced their beloved Jolly. "Don't mess up the paperwork, or the scrap iron sergeant will get you," they jest. They called her metal ugly, a piece of junk she probably found in a bazaar and pinned on to look interesting. They saw it as a pathetic attempt to claim a history she didn't have. In the harsh, merit-based world of a forward operating base, where respect was currency and it was earned through visible acts of strength and competence, Master Sergeant Sharma was bankrupt. She was just the old woman who counted boxes and wore a piece of trash on her shirt. Colonel Madsen, the FOB's commander, was a man carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountains around them. He was a field-grade officer from a long line of them, and he believed the war was won by trigger pullers, not clerks. He saw logistics as a necessary but irritating subordinate function, a service to be demanded, not a strategic partner. His first formal briefing with Sharma set the tone for their entire relationship. They stood in the cramped, plywood-walled Command Information Center, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone from the humming servers. A digital map of their area of operations glowed on a large screen, dotted with red icons indicating recent enemy activity. Madsen paced before it, a pointer stick tapping impatiently against his thigh. "Master Sergeant," he began, not making eye contact, his focus entirely on the map. "O'Malley kept my men supplied. He understood my intent. I need ammunition, water, and batteries. Everything else is a luxury. Can you handle that?" Sharma stood perfectly still, a data slate in her hands. "Sir, I can. But my initial inventory audit shows critical shortages in non-standard items. Specifically, hydraulic fluid for the MATV recovery vehicle, and replacement microcoolant lines for the LRAS-3 optics. We're also down to our last 3 dozen Arctic-grade power cells for the backup comms array. If a storm hits, Madsen stopped pacing and finally looked at her. His eyes were cold, dismissive. Master Sergeant, I am not interested in a dissertation on engine lubricants. I have patrols making contact with insurgent forces in Sector Gamma daily. My priority is bullets, not specialty oils. O'Malley knew how to prioritize. He knew how to make do. Can you? The question hung in the air, thick with condescension. He was challenging her fundamental competence, framing her meticulous concern as bureaucratic fussiness. I understand your priorities, Colonel, Sharma said, her voice even, betraying no emotion. But a recovery vehicle without hydraulics is a multi-ton paperweight, and optics that overheat in a firefight are useless. These aren't luxuries, they're force multipliers. Your job is to fill my requisitions, not to lecture me on tactics. Madsen snapped, his patience gone. Get me the bullets. Get me the water. Make the rest of it work. Is that clear? Crystal, sir, Sharma replied. She didn't salute. She simply turned and walked out of the CIC, the dismissal hanging in the air behind her like cordite. The exchange did not go unnoticed. Madsen's executive officer had been present, and word of the new Master Sergeant getting dressed down by the CO spread quickly. It cemented her status as an outsider, an irrelevant cog in the machine. Riggs and his cronies felt vindicated. That evening in the mess, Riggs sauntered over to the table where Sharma sat alone, nursing a cup of tea. Specialist Chen, a younger soldier who was quiet and observant, watched from a few tables away, a flicker of discomfort on his face. Heard the old man lit you up today, Master Sergeant? Riggs said, leaning over her table, his bulk blocking the light. Tough being a bean counter in a trigger puller's world. Huh? Sharma slowly raised her eyes from her cup. She looked at the intricate weave of his uniform sleeve, then at the insignia on his chest, then finally met his gaze. She said nothing. Riggs felt a strange prickle of unease at her silent appraisal, but he pushed on, emboldened by his audience. You know, O'Malley, he could get us anything. Anything. Said it was about knowing people, not about whining over paperwork. He gestured with his chin toward her collar. Guess that's what they give you for expert paperwork filing. Huh? The order of the empty ink cartridge. His friends chuckled. Sharma took a slow sip of her tea. She placed the cup down with deliberate care, the ceramic making a soft click against the metal table. Is there a supply request you needed to file, Sergeant? She asked, her voice flat. The simple, direct question disarmed him. He was prepared for anger, for a defense, for anything but calm, professional inquiry. He stammered for a second. No. Just making conversation. Then if you'll excuse me, she said, her gaze dropping back to her cup. I have manifests to review. The dismissal was absolute. She had not raised her voice, had not insulted him, but she had ended the conversation as surely as if she'd slammed a door in his face. Riggs, red-faced and flustered, backed away, muttering to his friends. Chun watched the entire exchange. He saw Riggs's bravado and Sharma's unnerving calm. He'd also seen her in the supply depot earlier that day. While O'Malley's depot had been a place of organized chaos, Sharma was transforming it. She worked with a relentless, silent efficiency, scanning barcodes, updating inventories on her slate, and rearranging pallets with the help of a forklift she handled with surprising dexterity. She found a crate of mislabeled medical supplies, vital clotting agents, that had been marked as simple bandages. She located a box of drone replacement propellers everyone thought was lost. She wasn't just counting. She was understanding. She was mapping the FOB's lifeblood. Chan, unlike the others, started to wonder if there was more to the quiet Master Sergeant than a stiff posture and an ugly piece of iron. The Zargos Mountains did not care for military timetables. 3 weeks after Sharma's arrival, they unleashed a storm of biblical proportions. It came without warning, a sudden, violent shift in barometric pressure that the regional command's long-range forecast had labeled a minor weather disturbance. Colonel Madsen had scoffed at the report. Sharma, however, had read the fine print, cross-referenced it with localized atmospheric data feeds she'd accessed, and felt a cold knot tighten in her gut. For 2 days prior, she had worked with a quiet urgency, subtly shifting supplies, ensuring the portable generators were topped with fuel, and that the emergency winterization kits, ignored for months in a forgotten corner of a storage container, were moved to a central, accessible location. No one noticed. The storm hit like a physical blow. The wind shrieked through the passes, a high, keening sound that vibrated in the bones. It carried with it a blinding wall of snow, thick and wet, that erased the world beyond 10 feet. The temperature plummeted 30 degrees in an hour. The FOB, already isolated, became a ship lost in a churning white sea. All air support was grounded indefinitely. The single, treacherous mountain road that served as their ground supply line was now buried under 10 feet of snow and avalanches. FOB Kestrel was completely, utterly alone. And then they came. The enemy had been waiting for this. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather, and they knew the FOB's vulnerabilities. Using the storm as impenetrable cover, they launched a full-scale, coordinated assault. It wasn't the usual potshots or probing attacks. This was a siege. Mortar rounds, their thumps muffled by the snow, began to fall with terrifying accuracy. Heavy machine gun fire ripped through the blizzard from unseen positions, tearing apart sandbags and shattering the nerve of younger sentries. The perimeter alarms, designed for clear weather, became a cacophony of false positives triggered by the wind and snow, rendering them useless. The soldiers were fighting blind, firing at muzzle flashes that appeared and vanished in the white chaos. Colonel Madsen stood in the CIC, his face a grim mask illuminated by the flickering screens, shouting orders that were becoming increasingly desperate. The first major blow landed an hour into the assault. A well-aimed mortar round slammed into the transformer yard next to the main generator building. There was a deafening roar, a flash of brilliant blue-white light, and the FOB was plunged into darkness and a sudden, shocking silence. The hum of electricity that was the constant background noise of their lives was gone. The lights, the heaters, the advanced surveillance systems, the main comms array, all dead. "Get the backup generator online. Now!" Madsen roared into his radio. A frantic voice crackled back. "Sir, we're trying." The sputtering. "The fuel line is frozen solid." This was the exact failure Sharma had foreseen. The Arctic-grade power cells she had tried to requisition were needed for the block heater on the backup generator's fuel intake. The standard cells, which Madsen had deemed sufficient, were frozen solid, useless. Panic, cold and sharp as an icicle, began to creep into the command tent. The medical tent was already receiving casualties, and the surgeons were now working by flashlight. The thermal optics on the heavy weapons were useless without power. The men on the line were cold, terrified, and fighting shadows. SFC Riggs and his squad were pinned down on the western perimeter, their radio screaming for support as enemy fighters used the darkness and confusion to crawl closer to the wire. The FOB was losing. The carefully constructed bubble of technological superiority had burst, and they were left with just men, guns, and the encroaching, freezing dark. Colonel Madsen, for the first time in his command, was losing control. The by-the-book solutions were failing, and the situation was spiraling into a catastrophe. While chaos erupted in the CIC and fear spread like a contagion through the ranks, Anya Sharma moved with a chillingly calm sense of purpose. The blackout hadn't surprised her. It had merely started a clock in her head. While Madsen was yelling, she was already moving. Her first destination was not the command post or the perimeter. It was the motor pool. The wind tore at her, whipping snow into her face, but she moved steadily through the darkness, a small, powerful flashlight cutting a path. She ignored the distant crackle of gunfire and the crump of mortars, her mind a cold, clear engine of calculation. The motor pool was a ghost yard of frigid steel. She swept her light over the hulking shapes of the vehicles until she found the one she wanted. A hemped A4 cargo truck. A beast, Its 152-liter diesel engine powered not just the truck, but a formidable integrated generator designed to run field equipment. It was, she knew from reading its technical manual cover to cover, their last chance. Specialist Chen, having been forced back from his post by a collapsing bunker wall, saw her light and ran towards it, his rifle at the ready. "Master Sergeant? What are you doing? We have to get to the main defensive line. We need power more than another rifle on the line right now, Specialist," Sharma said without stopping. Her voice was steady, cutting through the wind's howl. "Give me a hand." She climbed into the cab, her fingers, sure and practiced, finding the ignition in the dark. The engine turned over, coughed, and then roared to life with a belch of black smoke. The sound was a defiant roar against the storm. But starting the truck was the easy part. She slid out of the cab, popped the latches on the engine compartment, and gestured with her flashlight. "I need the heavy-duty jumper cables from the recovery vehicle, and the largest wrench set you can find. Move." Chen, caught in the undertow of her certainty, didn't question. He ran. While he was gone, Sharma pulled a small, heavy canvas roll from a side compartment of the HEMTT, her personal toolkit. Inside, nestled in worn leather loops, were specialized electrical tools, wire strippers, crimpers, a voltage meter. These were not standard issue. When Chen returned, dragging a thick, python-like set of cables, Sharma was already working, her flashlight clenched in her teeth. She was disconnecting the truck's main power distribution block. "Hold this steady," she commanded, pointing her light at a junction box. Her hands moved with the precise, unhurried grace of a surgeon. She stripped the ends of the heavy cables, bypassed the standard regulators, and began to wire them directly to the alternator's output leads. Sparks flew, sizzling in the falling snow, and the smell of ozone cut through the cold air. It was a dangerous, ad hoc bypass that would have made a motor pool sergeant faint, but Sharma worked as if she were disarming a bomb. "This will feed the CIC and the med tent," she explained, her voice muffled by the flashlight. "It won't power the whole base, but it'll give the colonel his eyes back and the docks their lights. Now, where is the main power conduit for the command post?" Chen, his awe growing, pointed towards a thick, armored cable running along the ground. Within 10 minutes, Sharma had spliced into it. She gave Chen a sharp nod. He relayed the message on his personal radio. In the CIC 100 yards away, the lights flickered, then came on, bathing the stunned command staff in a steady, humming glow. The main battle tracking screen lit up. They had eyes again. But Sharma was already thinking about the next problem. The western perimeter. Riggs's voice was still frantic over the net. They were taking casualties, and the enemy was massing in a shallow ravine just beyond the wire, using it as a covered approach. The FOB's 120mm mortars were their best answer. But the Fire Direction Center reported they were down to less than a dozen high-explosive rounds. Sharma keyed her own radio, patching into the FDC channel. "Fire Direction, this is Kestrel Logistics. What is your status on M930 series illumination rounds?" A confused voice answered back. Kestrel Logistics, we have a ton of those. Crates of them. But we need not parade ground crap. Negative, Fire Direction." Sharma's voice was clipped, authoritative. "I want a full salvo of Ilum, airburst, max elevation, coordinated for grid 3-4-9 or 8-1-2. Do it now." The coordinates were not in the ravine. They were 500 meters behind it. "Ma'am, that's way off target," the mortarman protested. "Trust me, Sergeant. Fire the mission," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. In the mortar pit, the gunners exchanged confused looks but obeyed the strange command. The tubes thudded, sending a volley of shells high into the blizzard. Seconds later, a series of brilliant, magnesium-white stars ignited in the sky, drifting down slowly on their parachutes. They were behind the ravine, exactly as she had ordered. On the western perimeter, the effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. Every enemy fighter in the ravine, who had been cloaked in darkness and snow, was suddenly thrown into perfect, stark silhouette against the curtain of brilliant white light. They were black shapes on a white canvas. What the hell? Riggs breathed into his radio. Then he understood. All stations, western perimeter, open fire, light 'em up. The heavy machine guns, which had been firing blindly, now had perfect targets. The staccato roar of the M2S and the rhythmic thumping of the Mk-19s filled the air. For the men on the line, it was a turkey shoot. The enemy assault faltered, then broke, as fighters caught in the open were cut down. Sharma's tactical call, born from a logistician's perfect knowledge of her inventory, had single-handedly broken the back of the enemy's main assault. Her work still wasn't done. A secondary explosion near the supply depot, her domain, signaled a new crisis. A satchel charge had blown a hole in the outer fence. A small fire team, for men, had slipped through the breach in the confusion, aiming to wreak havoc in the FOB's soft rear area. The few soldiers from the engineering section who were nearby were caught by surprise, pinned down by accurate fire. Sharma heard the distinct, close-quarters chatter of enemy AKs. She handed her radio to Chun. "Keep power running. Shoot anything that isn't us." She picked up her M4 carbine, which had been slung on her back, and moved toward the sounds of the fight. She didn't run. She flowed through the shadows between stacked shipping containers, her movements fluid and silent. She was a ghost in the swirling snow. She came up on the flank of the firefight, peering around the edge of a large container. 2 engineers were pinned behind a stack of sandbags. The 4 enemy fighters were advancing, using the depot's contents as cover. Sharma raised her rifle. Her breathing was slow, measured. The world seemed to slow down. She saw one of the fighters pause to reload behind a fuel drum. She exhaled, squeezed the trigger. 1 shot. The man dropped without a sound. She was already moving before he hit the ground, shifting to a new position behind a pallet of concertina wire. Another fighter popped up to provide covering fire. Sharma fired twice in quick succession, a controlled pair. Both rounds struck center mass. The second man crumpled. The remaining 2 realized they were being engaged from the flank. They turned, firing wildly in her direction. Bullets sparked off the container near her head. Sharma didn't flinch. She grabbed a small fire extinguisher from a nearby bracket, pulled the pin, and threw it into the open space between them. It landed with a clang. They shot at it, and it erupted in a thick cloud of white chemical fog. Under the cover of the impromptu smoke screen, she sprinted across the gap, dropping to one knee behind a disabled forklift. The 2 fighters, confused, advanced through the thinning cloud. One emerged, rifle up, scanning. Sharma's rifle cracked once more. He fell. The last man, seeing his team wiped out in seconds, panicked. He broke cover and ran. Sharma tracked him, her sights steady, but didn't fire. Instead, she let out a short, sharp whistle. SFC Riggs and 2 of his men, drawn by the firefight, came around the far side of the depot and neutralized the fleeing soldier. Riggs lowered his weapon, his chest heaving. He stared at the 4 bodies, then at the 2 shaken engineers, and then at Master Sergeant Sharma, who was calmly reloading her magazine. She hadn't sprayed bullets. She had used 6 rounds to neutralize 3 targets. Her movements, her composure, her lethal efficiency. It was not the work of a supply clerk. It was the work of something else entirely. He looked at her, at the quiet woman he and his men had mocked relentlessly, and for the first time, he felt a profound and unsettling sense of awe. He had just witnessed a master at work. As the storm broke and a pale, watery dawn illuminated the battered FOB, the sounds of battle were replaced by the groans of twisted metal and the shouts of men organizing damage control parties. The enemy had been repulsed, but the cost was high. The perimeter was a wreck, buildings were pockmarked with shrapnel, and the base was running on the thread of power supplied by Sharma's jury-rigged HEMTT. Just after sunrise, the distinct thumping of a Black Hawk helicopter cut through the air. It wasn't a medevac. It flew with the purpose of high command. It landed in the only clear space available, its rotor wash kicking up a blizzard of fresh snow and debris. The side door slid open, and a figure emerged, ducking under the blades. He was tall, ramrod straight, and on his collar, for stars glinted in the weak morning light. It was General Wallace, the theater commander. He'd been en route for a scheduled inspection of a base further in country when news of the Kestrel siege broke. He had diverted his flight immediately. Colonel Madsen, his face haggard and smudged with soot, met the general, snapping a salute. He began a hurried, flustered report, trying to frame the desperate defense as a textbook victory, glossing over the generator failure and the near collapse of the western perimeter. General Wallace listened with an impassive expression, his gaze sweeping over the scene of devastation. He cut Madsen off mid-sentence. "I'll see it for myself, Colonel." Wallace walked the perimeter, his boots crunching on spent shell casings. He spoke to the exhausted, grimy soldiers in the fighting positions, his questions quiet and direct. He wasn't interested in Madsen's polished report. He was listening to the men who had held the line. He saw the relief and respect in their eyes when they talked about the illumination rounds that had turned the tide. He saw the surgeons in the med tent who pointed to the steady glow of their overhead lights and spoke of the master sergeant who had hot-wired a truck and saved lives. His walk led him inevitably to the supply depot. There, amidst the cleanup, was Sharma. She wasn't resting. She was directing a small team, including Specialist Chen, in inventorying damaged supplies and securing critical assets. She was covered in grease from the HEMS engine and soot from the fire extinguisher, her uniform torn at the sleeve. Her blouse was unbuttoned at the collar from the exertion, and the ugly, dark iron metal was clearly visible against her shirt. General Wallace stopped dead. He walked slowly toward her, his entourage, including the nervous Colonel Madsen and a now silent SFC Riggs, following behind. The soldiers in the area paused their work, sensing the shift in gravity. The four-star general ignored everyone else. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, were locked on the crude piece of metal pinned to Sharma's blouse. He didn't ask her what it was. His voice, when he spoke, was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried across the silent depot with absolute clarity. "The Order of the Serrated Sun," he stated, his voice filled with a reverence that was utterly shocking. "Kaltovian Defense Force. My God, I thought they only minted 17 of those." A profound silence fell over the assembled soldiers. They stared at the ugly metal, then at the general, then back at Sharma. Riggs's jaw was slack. Colonel Madsen's face had gone pale. Wallace turned his head slowly, his piercing gaze finding Madsen. "Colonel," he said, his voice now like chips of ice, "do you have any idea who this is?" Madsen was speechless. He could only shake his head, a small, helpless gesture. "This is Master Sergeant Anya Sharma," the general announced, his voice ringing with authority. He looked back at Sharma, a history of shared, brutal knowledge passing between them in a single glance. Her call sign was Quartermaster. She was the senior enlisted advisor to the Kaltovian 5th Militia Brigade at Firebase Archangel. During the winter offensive 9 years ago, her entire advisory team was killed in the opening salvo. She was the sole survivor. He let that sink in before continuing, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of Riggs, Chan, and the other soldiers. For 3 days alone, she held the northern pass. She coordinated artillery strikes from a dying radio, scavenged ammunition and weapons from the dead, friend and foe alike, and rallied the surviving Kaltovian militia into a cohesive fighting force. The only reason the enemy's armored column never reached the Kaltovian capital was because this NCO and a handful of militiamen held that firebase until my rangers could break through. The Kaltovians gave her that medal. It's forged from the melted-down armor of the first enemy tank she destroyed with a captured rocket. He looked back at Sharma, his expression softening slightly. "The after-action report is sealed at the highest level. They told me you'd taken a quiet logistics post at Fort Irwin." Sharma finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, weary, but steady. "It was too quiet, General." The air on FOB Kestrel had changed. It was no longer just cold. It was heavy with the weight of revelation. The story of Firebase Archangel settled over the soldiers like a shroud, silencing all mockery, erasing all doubt. The ugly piece of iron pinned to Sharma's shirt was no longer scrap. It was a holy relic, a testament to a level of courage and resilience they could barely comprehend. General Wallace, a 4-star commander of an entire theater of war, stood before the grease-stained Master Sergeant. Then he did something that shattered every rule of military protocol, something none of the soldiers present would ever forget. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight, and executed a salute. It was not a casual gesture. It was a crisp, powerful, formal salute, delivered from a general to a non-commissioned officer. It was the ultimate, undeniable sign of profound respect, an acknowledgement that transcended rank and position. Master Sergeant Anya Sharma, her face impassive but her eyes holding a deep, weary understanding, returned the salute with equal precision. For a long moment, they held the pose, a silent communion of warriors in the wreckage of a battlefield. Colonel Madsen looked as if he had been struck. He saw not only the legendary soldier he had dismissed but the catastrophic failure of his own judgment. He had possessed a weapon of immense value and had treated it like a dull tool. The shame was a visible weight on his shoulders. The spell was broken when the general lowered his hand. He gave Sharma a short, meaningful nod, then turned and strode back toward his helicopter, his staff scrambling to keep up. He didn't say another word to Madsen. He didn't need to. Later that day, the atmosphere on the FOB was subdued, reverent. The soldiers worked with a renewed, determined purpose. The whispers were different now. The nickname Scrap Iron Sergeant was gone, buried under the weight of the truth. In its place, a new name, spoken with awe, Quartermaster. SFC Riggs found Sharma in the motor pool, where she was patiently instructing Chun on how to properly service the Hemp's jury-rigged power coupling. Riggs stood there for a long moment, shifting his weight, clearly struggling with what to say. The easy arrogance was gone, replaced by a humbling uncertainty. He couldn't bring himself to say, "I'm sorry." The words were too small, too inadequate for the depth of his misjudgment. Instead, he walked forward and held out a steaming metal mug. "Coffee, Master Sergeant," he said, his voice rough. "Fresh pot." Sharma paused her instruction. She looked at the mug, then up at Riggs's face. She saw the apology in his eyes, more clearly than any words could have expressed it. She took the mug. "Thank you, Sergeant," she said simply. Riggs's gaze dropped to the metal, now clean and stark against her uniform. He looked at it for a long second, then met her eyes again and gave a single sharp nod. It was a gesture of concession, of acknowledgement, of respect. He then turned and walked away without another word. Chun watched the exchange, understanding that a fundamental shift had occurred. He was no longer just learning about inventory from Sharma. He was learning about a kind of strength he had never known existed. The respect she had never asked for had finally, irrevocably, been given. Night fell again on the Zargos Mountains. A temporary, fragile peace settled over FOB Kestrel. The hum of the HEMTT generator was a steady heartbeat in the cold, thin air. The dead had been counted, the wounded were stable, and the perimeter was secure. In the CIC, a humbled Colonel Madsen was coordinating with command for resupply and reinforcement, his voice devoid of its usual arrogant bark. Master Sergeant Sharma was not in the command post receiving accolades. She was not in the mess tent, accepting the silent deference of the soldiers. She was where she was always most comfortable, in the quiet solitude of her supply depot. The large container was lit by a single, bare bulb hanging from a cord, casting long shadows that danced around her. She sat on an overturned crate, a small, worn canvas pouch open on her lap. From it, she took a small bottle of oil and a soft, clean piece of flannel. With deliberate, almost ritualistic care, she unpinned the order of the serrated sun from her blouse. She held it in the palm of her hand. The light caught its rough, dark surface. It wasn't designed to be beautiful. It was heavy, functional, and brutal. Its jagged points were sharp enough to cut. It was a medal that spoke not of parades and dress uniforms, but of blood and survival in the frozen dirt. It was a medal for a victory that felt only like not dying. She placed a single drop of oil on the flannel and began to clean the iron star. Her movements were slow, methodical, her focus absolute. She polished the face of it, her thumb tracing the outline of the broken sun, a symbol for a light that had almost been extinguished but had somehow, impossibly, held. She wasn't polishing it to a shine. The pitted iron would never gleam. She was tending to it, maintaining it, a quiet act of remembrance for the 17 souls, 16 Kaltovian, 1 American, represented by each of the original medals. She finished her work, the scent of gun oil hanging in the still air. She held the medal for a moment longer, its weight familiar and grounding in her palm. Then, she carefully pinned it back to the inside of her blouse, settling it into its accustomed place over her heart. It was hidden again, a private burden, a secret strength. She took a deep, steadying breath, the first she seemed to have taken all day. She stood up, her joints aching with cold and fatigue. She picked up her data slate and a clipboard from a nearby shelf. The battle was over, but the work was not. An emergency resupply request had to be perfect. Every bullet, every bandage, every battery had to be accounted for. The mission, for her, was eternal. It was the count, the manifest, the quiet, tireless work of keeping the machine running so that others could fight. Respect was a byproduct, not a goal. Survival was the only true victory. Under the lonely light of the single bulb, powered by a machine she had brought to life, Master Sergeant Anya Sharma went back to her inventory, her steady hand making notes on the manifest, ensuring that when the next storm came, they would be ready.